Hello everyone, I'm here to tell you some scary stories, but in a way that helps you relax and fall asleep. If you enjoy these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps a lot. Also, tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it right now. Now take a deep breath, listen to the gentle sound of the rain, and let your mind drift into the dark, peaceful world of tonight's story. The assignment. The week after my encounter with the Shadow Man, the world felt off, like waking from a dream you know wasn't a dream. My sleep was shallow, scattered with fragments of shadowy corridors and voices I couldn't place. I had hoped Lily would be back from her assignment, but she wasn't. Psychics, telepaths, those rare gifts made her essential in situations I could barely comprehend. And now I was alone. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the Bowie knife Richard had given me. Its silver edge gleamed under the dim motel lamp, a silent reminder that my work often teetered between research and survival. Richard had handed it over with a grin, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Emergency, Moore," he said, the corners of his eyes crinkling with amusement. I couldn't even hold it properly. My hands shook slightly as I ran a finger along the hilt. Survival didn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like fumbling with a too large knife in a dimly lit room. The dossier for the Mackenzie case lay spread out on the motel desk. I'd read it a dozen times, trying to absorb details that felt more like suggestions than facts. Hole in attic floor. 3 words, and yet my chest tightened. My logical brain wanted to dismiss it as a structural issue, an old house, a sagging joist, but the instinctive part of me that had survived Shadow Men encounters whispered otherwise. Lily's car had been left to me, her quiet note saying she'd be busy. The driveway of the Mackenzie residence appeared ordinary at first glance. White picket fence, manicured lawn, and a tire swing creaking lazily beneath a sprawling oak. Yet the mailbox bore the name Mackenzie, and that small mundane detail sent a shiver down my spine. Names held weight in our line of work. They often carried history, a subtle resonance that hinted at more than you could see. I approached the front door, smoothing my glasses and adjusting the collar of my shirt. Knock, knock. The sound echoed briefly, like it belonged to a different time. A woman's voice called out, sharp, startled, yet friendly. "Coming!" The door opened a crack, revealing a woman in her early 30s. She blinked at me like she wasn't sure what she'd just seen. "Hello?" I said, forcing the words to sound mundane. "Hello, my name is Elijah Moore. I'm with the Housing Committee. I believe you called us about a hole." I kept my tone even, though my stomach had begun a slow churn. The last name was fake, chosen for its ordinariness. Wiltboro would have screamed suspicion. Moore was forgettable, unremarkable, a quiet background noise in the world. Her eyes widened just slightly when I mentioned the hole. Relief flashed across her face. "Oh, of course, please come in," she said, stepping back to let me pass. She carried a basket of baby clothes in one arm, juggling it like a single mother who had long ago mastered the art of multitasking. "I guess you guys were quick," she said with a smile, setting the basket on a side table. "When I broke my air conditioning, it took weeks for anyone to respond." "Yeah, well, holes are serious," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "People falling through them. Health hazard and all." I didn't mention the all that included more than physical harm. She nodded as if she understood something beyond the words. "Oh yes," she said, then extended her hand. "I'm Madison, though everyone calls me Maddie. I know it's a big ask, but could you keep this quiet? My son is sleeping upstairs. Loud noises will set him off." "Absolutely," I said. Quiet had been my ally long before knives and runestones ever existed. She led me upstairs, pulling down a rickety ladder to the attic. The heat hit me first, a muggy, almost oppressive warmth, thick like syrup in the lungs. The hole was larger than expected, 3 feet across, perfectly circular, and impossibly deep. I peered down, but the darkness swallowed any sense of depth. The floor below, a study, was completely untouched. The hole wasn't a missing section of floor. It wasn't a structural accident. It was something else. I snapped photos and jotted notes. Madison hovered at the top of the ladder, watching me. "It's weird," she said softly. "I tried throwing glow sticks down, but they just vanish." She didn't laugh, didn't joke. The normalcy in her tone clashed with the strangeness of the attic. I nodded, packing up. "I'll need to come back. Till then, please stay out of the attic." She agreed. Later, in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Images of the hole rotated behind my eyes. At night, I revisited the attic in my mind, tracing the edges of the void, imagining what lay beneath. Logic failed, physics failed. And when sleep finally claimed me, it came with dreams of whispers that called my name in soft, urgent tones. By morning, I was back at the Mackenzie residence, armed with cameras, glow sticks, and a GPS tracker. Each object dropped into the hole disappeared. Nothing returned. Not a single light signal, not a trace of anything. Only the silence and the heat, strangely comforting yet impossibly alien. At one point I reached my arm toward the void. The air clung to my skin, pulling slightly as if the hole itself were alive, breathing, waiting. The sensation was terrifying in its intimacy. A sudden cry from baby George downstairs yanked me from the attic. Time was irrelevant. The void seemed to stretch and bend it. By midday I packed up again, retreating from a place that didn't belong to the known world. That night, as I tried to calm myself in the car, I realized something terrifying. The hole wasn't just a mystery. It was a presence, patient and deliberate, beginning its slow pull on me. Morning arrived sluggishly, reluctant to shine its light on me. Motel rooms have a way of trapping you between worlds, the outside sun, the mundane, and the interior shadows that feel alive. I showered mechanically, each droplet a minor attempt to wash off the weight of the previous day. Nothing worked. The hole in the Mackenzie attic had a presence I couldn't scrub away. It wasn't in the air. It wasn't even physical. It was knowledge, a gnawing, patient awareness that I hadn't earned, but that had noticed me. Breakfast was cold, stale toast and weak coffee from the motel lobby. I flipped through my notes, sketches of the hole's edges, my attempts at measurement, glow sticks that had disappeared without a trace. Every methodical, logical attempt to make sense of it had failed. I wanted to believe it was just a trick of light or heat, some architectural anomaly. The small voice in my head said, no, it's not. By 10 a.m., I was back at the Mackenzie residence. The neighborhood was quiet, suburban quiet, the kind that feels comfortable until it doesn't. The car tires crunched along the gravel driveway, and I noticed for the first time the subtle shift in the air around the house. It was warmer here, but not oppressive. The shadows of the oak stretched across the lawn, long and impossibly dark, though the sun was well past its peak. Madison was on the porch, holding George close. She looked exhausted, pale around the eyes, but alert. She forced a small smile as I approached. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Morning," she replied. Her voice was lighter than I expected, but her eyes, those tired, dark-rimmed eyes, told a story I didn't yet want to read. We moved inside. The house smelled faintly of baby powder and old wood. Even that mundane scent felt altered, heavier somehow. I set my notebook on the table, flipping to a blank page, pen poised. "So," I started cautiously, "any changes with the hole since yesterday?" Madison shook her head. "No, I haven't gone near it. George, he's been sleeping more or less normally." I nodded, making notes. Sleep patterns, her own observations, any small detail could matter. "You haven't seen anything unusual? Heard anything?" I asked, careful not to press too hard. Her lips pressed together, her eyes distant. "No, just that feeling. Like the attic isn't part of the house anymore. Like it's waiting. I can't explain it." I scribbled that down, underlining it twice, waiting. That word carried weight. It implied awareness, patience, and intention. We spent the morning documenting the attic again. I mounted cameras on poles, checked the glow sticks and the GPS signaler. Each had vanished again. Nothing returned. It was as if the hole refused interaction, as if it decided what could exist within it. I reached my arm toward the edge, but stopped before touching it. I had no scientific explanation for the sensation. The air around the hole pulled subtly at my skin, like static electricity combined with the faintest suction. It wasn't strong, just noticeable enough to unsettle me. Madison hovered near the ladder, keeping George close. I don't go near it anymore," she whispered. "I can't. I don't want to wake it." Her words made me pause. "Wake it?" I asked, though my voice betrayed a shiver. "I don't know what it wants," she admitted. "I thought it was angry at first, but now I'm not sure. I just know it's there, and I don't want it to notice me." A silence settled over the room that was heavier than any physical weight. I considered leaving. Logically, retreat would be sensible. Emotionally, retreat felt like surrender. The hole hadn't done anything aggressive yet, and yet the pull, the attention, it was enough. Enough to tighten the chest, to make the hands tremble without warning. We left the attic and sat in the study below. Madison rocked George gently in the chair. I observed her, noting the subtle ways she flinched at creaks in the floor, the way she glanced at the attic stairs as though expecting them to move on their own. I attempted conversation, carefully mundane, the weather, a neighbor's yard, anything to anchor both of us in normality. Every time I looked at the hole, I realized how meaningless normal had become. By late afternoon, I had attempted to map the hole visually. Photographs, measurements, sketches, each confirmed the same impossibility. The hole led nowhere, yet consumed everything. It obeyed no laws of physics, and yet, nothing about its impossibility screamed danger outright. It whispered instead a patient promise. I would notice it. I left the Mackenzie residence that evening for the motel, parking the car carefully under the shadow of a street lamp. I had the eerie sense that something in the house watched me leave. Not Madison, not George, not even the air itself. Something more subtle, patient, waiting for me to return. Sleep came reluctantly. I lay in the back seat, notes clutched to my chest, the shadows of the car deepening around me. In my dreams, the attic was larger, darker, but still warm. The hole pulsed slightly like a heartbeat. A whisper, distant at first, repeated a single word. Wait, morning would come again, but the hole wouldn't be gone. And neither would the feeling that I was being observed, not by a human, but by something patient, deliberate, and unnervingly aware. When I woke the next morning, I realized I had been dreaming about the house again. Not vividly, no clear shapes, no defined faces, just impressions. The smell of dust, the dim gold of an attic light, the faint sound of something shifting its weight just beyond the edge of sight. It was becoming a pattern. Every night since I'd first seen the hole, it was there, somewhere in the back of my consciousness, quietly waiting. I brewed coffee in the motel kitchenette and let it sit until it went cold. My notes from the last 2 days were scattered across the table, pages warped from the humidity. The handwriting looked unfamiliar, jagged, uneven. I told myself it was exhaustion, but even my exhaustion had structure once. This was different. Before I left, I opened the small leather pouch that held my runestone, a low-grade one cracked from an old assignment. The thing wasn't powerful enough to repel anything substantial, but it grounded the mind. It reminded you what reality felt like when it began to slip. I kept it in my pocket, rubbing its edges every time I felt the world lean too far toward something else. When I arrived at the Mackenzie residence, Madison answered almost immediately. She looked worse than before. Her hair was tied back hastily, and her eyes had that fragile redness of someone who hadn't slept. "Morning," I said, offering a polite nod. "Morning," she echoed, her tone slow and distracted. George wasn't in her arms this time. I didn't ask where he was. I could hear faint cooing from the baby monitor in the living room. We exchanged a few pleasantries, the kind of surface-level words that people use to delay the real conversation. But the real conversation came quickly, as it always did here. "You said yesterday the hole felt like it was waiting," I began, flipping open my notebook. "Has anything changed since then?" She hesitated before answering. "It's quieter. I don't hear it as much. But sometimes when I'm upstairs, it's like the air moves differently. Like the room is smaller." I wrote that down. Spatial distortion wasn't new in these kinds of phenomena. Some entities warped perception simply by existing. "Do you remember anything from last night?" I asked. She frowned, biting her lip. "I dreamed I was standing at the attic door. Just standing there holding George. I didn't want to go in, but something was pulling me to. When I woke up, the ladder was already down." That detail made my pulse quicken. "You're sure you didn't pull it down yourself?" She shook her head. "No, I swear I didn't. The ladder had been folded neatly when I left last night. For it to be extended by morning meant someone had moved it. Or maybe something wanted her to think it had. I asked to inspect the attic again. She hesitated, holding my gaze for a moment longer than felt natural. Then she nodded. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed. The air grew heavy, dense. That same oppressive heat pressed down on me, and yet the area around the hole remained strangely neutral, like it existed outside of temperature altogether. I crouched beside it, flashlight in hand. The beam swallowed instantly when I aimed it into the hole. It didn't reflect back, not even a hint of dust in the air. Just blackness that absorbed everything. I placed a small glass marble near the edge. It rolled gently toward the center and disappeared. No sound, no impact. Simply gone. When I exhaled, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I looked at the camera setup from yesterday. Still in place, the lens pointed straight at the hole. I checked the recording. Static. Every frame that should have shown the hole was a field of grey noise, though the rest of the attic appeared clearly. It was as if the hole didn't want to be observed. I felt that same subtle pull on my skin, that almost affectionate current of air wrapping around my wrist. A whisper followed. Not words exactly, but the shape of words, like language just beyond comprehension. I stumbled back and nearly tripped over my own equipment. The whisper stopped. The attic was silent again, except for the faint hum of the ceiling bulb. When I descended, Madison was pacing the hallway, holding George. She looked up quickly. "You were gone a long time," she said. "Not that long," I replied automatically. But when I checked my watch, nearly 2 hours had passed. I had no memory of that time. My notes said nothing of it either. Just a few half-scribbled symbols that didn't look like English. We both sat at the kitchen table. I drank the coffee she had made. It was strong, rich, freshly ground. It helped steady my nerves. "Do you ever feel like it's listening?" she asked suddenly. I set down the cup. "What do you mean?" "When I talk about it," she said, glancing toward the ceiling. "Sometimes the house feels different, like the air shifts a little. I don't know how to describe it. I did. I'd felt it myself. I just didn't want to confirm her fear." That afternoon, I returned to the attic one last time before leaving. I hammered a small iron nail into the floorboards near the hole, a marker, not protection. Just something real to remind me the world still obeyed its own rules somewhere. As I drove away, the late sunlight flickered through the trees, casting long shadows across the dashboard. My head felt foggy, like I'd left part of myself behind in that attic. At the motel, I played back my own audio recordings. For the most part, they were silence, the creak of boards, the hum of my breathing. But once, faintly, between 2 clicks of static, a voice whispered my name. Not Elijah, not Moore, not Wiltborough, just a sound, like recognition. I turned off the recorder. I didn't sleep that night. Sleep had become a technicality. I could lie still, close my eyes and slow my breathing, but true rest was impossible. My mind replayed every sound I'd heard in that attic, every word Madison had said, every detail I might have missed. By the 3rd night, I'd stopped pretending that sleep was an option. The motel room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had shifted while I wasn't looking. The hum of the air conditioner was constant, a low mechanical whisper that filled the silence. Yet every so often, I would think I heard something beneath it, like the echo of my own heartbeat delayed by a fraction of a second. I told myself it was exhaustion. Nothing more. At 2:14 a.m. I gave up on rest. I sat at the small table, writing notes under the flickering light. Each line of handwriting was less legible than the last. I'd started with objective observations: temperature, atmospheric pressure, possible causes for optical distortion. By page 3, my notes had devolved into thoughts. Maybe the whole doesn't lead somewhere. It replaces what used to be there. Could absence be a thing that exists? Why does it feel like it's looking for me? I stopped writing after that. Some thoughts are safer when they stay unspoken. The next morning, I returned to the Mackenzie house earlier than usual. Madison opened the door immediately, as if she'd been waiting for me. Her face looked thinner, her eyes deeper set. "Morning," she said quietly. "Morning," I answered, matching her tone. "Everything all right?" She hesitated. "I heard something last night. Not from the attic this time. From the baby monitor." I followed her into the living room. The monitor sat on the coffee table, silent and harmless now. "It wasn't static," she continued. "It sounded like whispering. I thought maybe it was you." "Me?" "I don't know," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It sounded familiar." Her words hung between us like smoke. Familiar. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us moving. George stirred in his crib nearby, and that small human noise felt like a miracle. Something real, something alive. I decided to check the attic again. It had become routine, a pattern, even though each time I climbed that ladder I felt a new weight in my chest. The air was dry and heavy as always, The light bulb hummed faintly. Nothing had moved since yesterday. Still, when I approached the hole, my pulse quickened. I crouched beside it and ran my hand across the boards. The wood near the edge was warmer than the rest. I pressed my palm against it. The warmth pulsed once, slow, deliberate. I jerked my hand back and nearly fell. No sound followed, no movement. The attic was as still as a photograph. It took several minutes for my heartbeat to slow enough to trust my balance. I recorded a few temperature readings, though I doubted they meant anything now. Downstairs, Madison was standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the yard. Her reflection in the glass looked distant, almost detached. "Do you ever feel," she said softly, "like it wants us to leave it alone, but also not to?" Her phrasing was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. The hole didn't seem to crave attention. It tolerated it, like a predator that allows you to approach, not out of kindness but curiosity. I didn't respond. I couldn't think of anything that wouldn't sound hollow. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to clear my head. The streets were busy, bright, full of noise. It should have been comforting. But the longer I stayed among people, the more unreal it felt. Every conversation sounded like it was happening underwater. Every face blurred slightly if I looked too long. When I returned to the motel, I noticed something strange. My camera footage. The same recordings that had been filled with static before now contained faint sound. Not much, just the low creak of the attic floorboards. But in the last minute of footage, a voice, soft, slow, almost mechanical, murmured something I couldn't make out. I played it back several times, adjusting the volume, isolating frequencies. Finally, one word emerged. Below, it wasn't my voice. It wasn't Madison's. I shut off the computer, locked the file, and sat motionless for what felt like an hour. The clock on the wall ticked unevenly, the seconds skipping now and then. Or maybe my perception was skipping. When I finally fell asleep, it was accidental. The dream came immediately. I was in the attic again. The hole was there, but larger this time, almost touching the edges of the walls. The light above it swung gently, though there was no wind. I stood at the edge looking down. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It moved, slowly, like the surface of deep water disturbed by something vast beneath. I didn't hear words, but I felt intention. A question, a request. I didn't understand it, but my body reacted before my mind could. I reached out toward it. When I woke, my hand was extended off the side of the motel bed, fingers curled as though grasping something. My palm was cold. The runestone in my pocket was gone. By the next morning, I was acutely aware of a change in myself. It wasn't dramatic, no hallucinations or voices yelling in my ears, but subtle, insidious, and unrelenting. My thoughts were slower, my memory fragmented. Small details slipped away unnoticed. A misplaced pen, the direction of a chair, the time on my watch. I chalked it up to fatigue at first. After 3 nights of disturbed sleep, 3 days of tense observation, it seemed natural. Yet the feeling gnawed at the edges of my mind. Something beyond exhaustion was at work. At the Mackenzie residence, Madison greeted me quietly. Her voice, normally patient and calm, carried a tension that made me flinch. Her eyes held an almost imperceptible hollowness. George slept in his crib, unaware, innocent in his soft cotton blankets. "Morning?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "Morning," she echoed. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though measuring each motion before committing to it. We went upstairs to the attic. The air was thicker than before, pressing against my skin and lungs. I could feel my pulse quicken, even without looking at a clock. The hole remained unchanged at first glance, perfectly circular, impossibly deep. But something was different. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. There was awareness now, subtle and deliberate, like someone or something was examining me as I examined it. I set up my cameras again, carefully positioning them to avoid triggering any response. The glow sticks and GPS tracker had been useless before, but repetition sometimes helped in noticing small differences. I noticed one immediately. The edges of the hole seemed slightly frayed, almost like the surrounding wood had softened. Not structurally. It wouldn't have mattered to a carpenter, but perceptually. My hand twitched, an unconscious urge to touch the edge. To confirm it was real, solid, I resisted. "Do you feel it?" I asked Madison softly as she stood near the ladder, watching me. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not like before, but I can't explain it." It's like a weight in the room, a presence. You know it's there even when you're not looking. I nodded but said nothing. Words would not help here. Observation was the only tool left that could offer clarity, or at least the illusion of clarity. I approached the hole, flashlight in hand. The beam swallowed itself in the void, unable to illuminate even a fraction of its depth. The smell of old wood and dust remained unchanged, almost comforting in its consistency. Yet the air itself carried a subtle vibration, a low-frequency hum that set my teeth on edge. I placed a small notebook near the edge. The vibration didn't affect it, but I noticed something strange. The notebook shifted slightly. Not enough to fall, not enough to roll, but enough to register on my peripheral vision. I stepped back. Madison flinched when I did. It moves sometimes, she whispered. Moves? I asked, just slightly. Tiny things always. I thought I was imagining it. Until last night when I saw the shadow. She cut herself off abruptly, glancing toward George, who stirred in his sleep. I didn't press her. I didn't need to. The air of fear, unspoken and restrained, was enough. I spent the next hour documenting measurements, repeating attempts from previous days. Nothing definitive emerged. The hole remained unchanged in size, yet increasingly impossible to ignore. Every second in its presence felt elongated, as if time itself hesitated. Afterward, I left the house to clear my head. Walking through the neighborhood, I noticed small, almost imperceptible anomalies. Shadows fell differently. A bird paused mid-flight for a split second too long. The sun glinted off a window and cast a reflection that lingered unnaturally before fading. Nothing overtly impossible, just slightly off. Enough to make me question my own perception. Back at the motel, I reviewed yesterday's footage again. Static, mostly. But once, very briefly, a flicker. The edge of the hole seemed to stretch, elongate slightly, almost as if observing me through the lens. My pulse jumped. I shut the laptop, rubbed my eyes, and realized my hands were trembling. Fatigue. Perhaps fear? Definitely the night was restless. My dreams returned with more intensity. I found myself in the attic again. The hole was larger, closer, and the shadows seemed to crawl along the walls following my movements. I didn't hear words this time, only a hum, low and insistent, vibrating through my skull. I woke with a start, hands cold and damp with sweat. The motel was silent, yet I felt the pull again. Subtle, almost welcoming, urging me to return to the attic, to the hole. I lay awake until dawn, debating. Rational thought battled instinct. Leave it alone, retreat, escape. But the pull persisted, persistent and quiet, and I realized I wasn't being summoned. I was being observed. And the observation didn't stop just because I left. By the time I returned to the Mackenzie residence that morning, I could already feel the strain in my own mind. Small inconsistencies had begun to pile up. A door left slightly ajar that I was sure I had closed, the hum of the fridge a fraction higher than before, or a shadow that lingered too long along the staircase. Each one seemed insignificant, yet together they formed a quiet, gnawing chorus that I couldn't ignore. Madison greeted me at the door, holding George in her arms. She looked thinner still, her dark circles deeper. Her movements just a little too precise, too calculated, like she was holding herself in check. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual, though my chest felt tight. "Morning," she replied quietly, her voice measured, almost rehearsed. We sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. She stirred hers slowly, the spoon scraping faintly against the cup with each rotation. I watched her, noting the small, almost imperceptible tremor in her hand. The hole wasn't speaking, wasn't moving, and yet its presence hovered over us like a shadow, compressing the air in the room. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not really. George woke a few times. But it's more than that. I feel like the house is waiting. Like it knows we're here," I didn't reply. I couldn't. Her observation mirrored my own experience exactly, yet saying it aloud made it worse. We headed upstairs to the attic. The ladder creaked under my weight, the sound sharp against the otherwise oppressive quiet. The heat pressed down on me as always, thick and stagnant. The hall was unchanged in size, perfectly circular, yet its presence felt heavier than before. I could feel it tugging at the edges of my awareness, a constant low hum just beneath consciousness. I set up the cameras again, trying to maintain some control, some semblance of procedure. The previous days had taught me that observation alone was not enough. The hole responded differently depending on my actions. Subtle shifts, minor gestures, even where I stood, everything mattered. Madison hovered near the ladder, watching. She flinched at the smallest sound, her eyes darting constantly. I could tell she was trying to be calm, to suppress any hint of fear for George's sake. "Do you feel it changing?" I asked softly. She hesitated. "Yes, sometimes. Not in size, not visibly, but I can feel it in the room. Like the air bends slightly when I move. Like it shifts when I look away." Her words confirmed the strangest suspicion I had yet. The hole wasn't just a static anomaly. It was adaptive, responsive, aware. I placed my hand near the edge, careful not to touch. The air around it pulled subtly at my skin, warm and insistent, like a mild current tugging at my fingers. I recoiled slightly, more from instinct than fear. Downstairs, Madison was fidgeting with George's blanket, her movements nervous, deliberate. I observed her quietly, trying to avoid drawing attention to the slight tremor in my own hands. The day passed in a tense blur. I documented measurements, notes, sketches. Each entry, each observation, felt like an attempt to anchor myself to something real. Yet the hole's presence gnawed at the edges of rational thought. Every shadow, every faint sound, every subtle shift in the room's temperature made my chest tighten. By late afternoon, I left for a short walk, desperate to clear my head. The streets of the neighborhood seemed wrong. Shadows lingered in unnatural ways. Reflections in windows stayed a fraction too long. Familiar faces appeared slightly altered, almost as if they were being observed alongside me. Back at the motel, I tried to focus on my recordings, to review footage and audio from the attic. Static filled most of it, but faint anomalies appeared. A slight elongation at the edge of the hole in one shot, a whisper-like vibration in the audio track I could barely hear. I shut the computer, rubbing my temples. My pulse was rapid, hands trembling despite my best efforts to steady them. The hole wasn't just a presence in the attic, it was following me in thought, in observation, persistent and quiet. Night arrived, as it always did, bringing with it the familiar dread. Sleep was impossible. My dreams were vivid, oppressive. I was back in the attic, standing on the edge of the hole. The darkness below pulsed, subtle but alive, reacting to my thoughts, my fear, my attention. I could sense it waiting, patient, deliberate. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat. The motel room was silent. The hum of the air conditioner a faint reminder of normalcy. My hand rested unconsciously on my notebook, clutching it as though it could anchor me to reality. I realized then, fully, that the hole was not simply in the attic. It had begun to follow me, to reach past its physical boundaries into thought, memory, and perception. The day started with the usual weight in my chest, the kind of pressure that didn't ease with movement or sunlight. Even driving to the Mackenzie residence felt wrong. The familiar streets were subtly distorted. A mailbox that should have been on the right was slightly off. A parked car seemed closer than it should have been. Shadows fell in ways my mind couldn't reconcile with the sun's position. I forced myself to blink, thinking logic would reset perception. It didn't. Madison answered the door before I could knock. George was in her arms, awake this time, watching me with wide, curious eyes. Her face looked paler than the day before, more drawn. The lines beneath her eyes were sharper, the tension in her jaw constant. "Morning," I said, voice careful. "Morning," she replied softly. She held George close, cradling him as though he were a shield between her and something else. Inside, the house felt heavier. Every step creaked in places they shouldn't have. The air seemed thicker, almost viscous, pressing on my lungs. The attic ladder loomed above us, unchanged yet menacing. We avoided it at first, sitting in the living room while I reviewed yesterday's notes. My handwriting had become jagged, hurried. Measurements and observations mingled with speculation and paranoia. Lines and arrows crisscrossed the pages, highlighting the parts of reality that seemed off. Madison spoke first. I think it's affecting me more than I realized." Her voice was quiet, tremulous. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not alone, even when George is asleep, even when you're not here." I nodded, trying not to betray my own rising anxiety. She wasn't imagining it. I'd felt the same subtle intrusions, the almost imperceptible pressure of being watched, measured, studied. "Let's go upstairs," I suggested carefully. Just to check things. The ladder protested under my weight. The attic air, thick and warm as always, enveloped me immediately. The hole sat there at its center, a perfect circle impossibly deep. The light from the bulb above seemed to avoid it, diffused unnaturally, leaving the edges in soft shadow. I set up the cameras again, trying to remain methodical. Madison lingered near the ladder, whispering reassurances to George, who squirmed in her arms. "Do you feel it change?" I asked softly. She nodded, eyes wide. "Sometimes. It's subtle, like the air bends when I step back. Or the shadows. They move wrong. I thought it was just me imagining it." I recorded her observation meticulously. Each note, each subtle change mattered. Yet the more I documented, the more aware I became of my own mind. Small discrepancies in perception, things that should have been impossible, began appearing outside the attic. A shadow lingering too long in a hallway. A reflection in a mirror that didn't match reality exactly. A sound, distant yet familiar, like a whisper I couldn't place. We descended from the attic eventually. Madison was pale, her movements slow and deliberate, like a person trying to navigate invisible obstacles. George was quiet in her arms, unaware of the tension pressing down on us. I left the house for a short drive, hoping fresh air and distance would help. The neighborhood was familiar, yet subtly altered. Street signs slightly askew, shadows falling inconsistently. The pattern repeated on every block. My pulse quickened. The subtle distortions weren't localized. They were following me. At the motel, I reviewed the footage again. The static that had been a constant companion now flickered in ways I hadn't noticed before. Shadows at the edges of the hole seemed longer, distorted. Sometimes I could swear I saw movement, tiny shifts, almost imperceptible, at the very edge of perception. That night, sleep was impossible. Dreams returned vivid and oppressive. I was back in the attic, standing at the edge of the hole. The shadows moved in response to my focus, rippling, stretching. The air itself felt alive, warm and insistent. I woke gasping, my hands trembling. The motel room was silent, air conditioner humming normally, but the subtle pressure in my chest remained. The hole wasn't confined to the attic anymore. It had begun extending into thought, perception and memory. I realized fully then that observation alone was no longer enough. It was no longer a passive presence. It was patient, deliberate and aware, measuring me, anticipating my attention. By the next morning, I felt it before even opening my eyes. A tightness in my chest, a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure behind my temples. My thoughts moved sluggishly, like molasses running through a narrow tube. Coffee did little to help. My hands shook slightly as I scribbled notes, trying to maintain methodical order, but the lines on the page wavered, unsure of where they belonged. At the Mackenzie house, Madison greeted me again, carrying George, who seemed calm for now. Her eyes were hollowed slightly, darkened, and her movements were precise, almost too deliberate. I could sense she was forcing herself to remain steady, for both George's sake and my own, but the strain was clear. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice low, careful. "Morning," she echoed softly. No inflection, no warmth. Her gaze flicked toward the attic ladder, as though expecting something. We sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee in silence. The quiet wasn't comforting. The stillness of the house had changed. It pressed down on me, heavy, almost physical. I started, but Madison interrupted. "I can feel it more now," she admitted. Her voice was strained. "Even when I'm downstairs. Even when George is asleep. The room, it moves around me. I feel it shift if I look away. If I blink." I nodded, careful not to betray my own rising unease. The hole wasn't just a physical phenomenon. It extended beyond the attic, subtly, imperceptibly altering perception. We ascended the attic ladder together. The air grew thick, as always, warm and heavy. The hole waited at its center, perfectly circular, black beyond comprehension. I set up my equipment methodically, carefully avoiding sudden movements. Madison hovered near the ladder, clutching George to her chest. "Do you feel it now?" I asked softly. "Yes," she whispered. "It watches, it waits, it knows." I made careful measurements, recorded temperature and airflow. Nothing concrete emerged. Every observation only confirmed one truth. The hole was a sentient, aware anomaly. Small objects I placed near it shifted subtly. Glow sticks vanished instantly. Even the cameras I set up to monitor it sometimes failed, recording only static. After several hours, I left the house for a short drive, hoping that distance would help my mind. But outside, the world itself had begun to betray me. Shadows fell in unnatural ways. Reflections lingered slightly too long. Familiar faces in passing seemed altered. I realized with a sickening clarity that the hole was extending its influence beyond the physical attic. My perception was no longer trustworthy. Returning to the motel, I reviewed footage again. The hole's edges flickered subtly. Shadows elongated, warped. In one shot, I thought I saw something. A dark shape crouching near the edge, impossible to define. The static distorted around it. I turned off the monitor, rubbing my temples. That night, sleep came unbidden. Dreams were vivid, oppressive. I stood in the attic at the edge of the hole. The shadows moved as if aware of my gaze. The air itself felt alive, warm, insistent. When I awoke, my hands were cold, trembling. My thoughts felt slower, fragmented. The motel room was silent, normal. Yet the pressure in my chest persisted. The hole wasn't confined to the attic anymore. It had begun reaching into thought, memory, perception. Observation alone would no longer be enough. I realized then that this was no longer just a case. It was an endurance test, an unspoken challenge by a phenomenon that waited, patient and deliberate, just beyond comprehension. By the 9th day, exhaustion had crept into my bones in a way that no sleep or coffee could remedy. Every step felt weighted. Every sound, no matter how small, set my nerves taut. Even the familiar streets leading to the Mackenzie residence seemed slightly altered. Mailboxes shifted, shadows lingered a fraction too long, and the sunlight fell inconsistently. Madison greeted me at the door, holding George. Her face was paler than before, the strain visible in the slight tremor of her hands. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if every motion required calculation. Her eyes flicked constantly toward the attic ladder. "Morning," I said, voice careful. "Morning," she replied softly, clutching George closer. The baby seemed unusually still, unusually quiet. We went upstairs to the attic, and the familiar weight of oppressive air pressed down immediately. Heat, humidity, and the almost imperceptible pull of the hole wrapped around me. Its presence wasn't loud, wasn't violent. It was patient, deliberate, and insidious. I set up the cameras again. Glow sticks and GPS markers had proven useless. The hole absorbed everything I threw at it, even my attempts at observation. I placed a small notebook near the edge, just a marker to gauge any subtle changes. It shifted slightly, no more than a centimeter, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Madison stood near the ladder, clutching George tightly. Her eyes were wide, haunted. "It watches," she whispered. "Even when I'm downstairs, even when you're gone. I feel it, I can't ignore it." I didn't respond. Observation alone had become futile. The hole wasn't passive. It was aware, calculating, subtly bending perception and attention. By late afternoon, I left the house to clear my head. The neighborhood outside felt wrong. Streets subtly altered, shadows inconsistent, reflections lingering unnaturally in windows. My pulse quickened. I realized the influence wasn't confined to the attic. It extended subtly, almost imperceptibly, into the surrounding world, into thought and perception. Returning to the motel, I reviewed footage again. Static filled most of it, but subtle distortions emerged. Shadows stretching slightly, minor movements at the edge of the hole. Once I thought I saw something crouching near the edge, a dark, indistinct shape that flickered in and out of view. Sleep was impossible that night. Dreams became oppressive. I was back in the attic, standing at the edge of the hole. Shadows rippled, reacting to my gaze. The air itself seemed alive, warm and insistent. It wasn't aggressive, it didn't need to be. Its patience and deliberation were far more unsettling. When I awoke, my hands trembled. My mind felt fragmented. Memory slipping in small ways, misplaced pens, uncertainty about time. The motel room was silent, normal, yet the pressure in my chest persisted. The hole was no longer confined to the attic. Its influence had extended into thought, memory, and perception. Observation alone was insufficient. I realized fully that this was no longer just a case. It was an endurance test, a patient, deliberate presence that measured me constantly, slowly eroding certainty and sanity. The night had settled over the Mackenzie residence like a heavy blanket, thick and suffocating. Every streetlight outside cast long, warped shadows that seemed to stretch into the house, brushing against the walls. I parked the car and stared at the front door for longer than necessary, mentally preparing myself. Tonight, there would be no rational observers to record, no cameras to provide distance. Tonight it would be just me, Madison, George, and the hole. I entered quietly. The house was still, almost too still. George's soft breathing from the crib upstairs was the only sound that reassured me anything remained normal. Madison greeted me at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. "I can feel it. Stronger now," she whispered. Her hands gripped George tightly, and I noticed subtle tremors running down her arms. "It wants something. I think it's ready to take." My pulse accelerated. I'd suspected that the hole wasn't passive, but hearing it confirmed by Madison's own perception brought the dread into a physical, unbearable form. "Stay calm," I said carefully. "We'll figure this out." We ascended to the attic, the ladder groaning under our combined weight. The familiar oppressive air pressed down immediately, heavy and thick. The heat from before now augmented by a subtle pressure, almost gravitational, pulling at our bodies. The hole waited at its center. Black, circular, impossible. No light touched its depth. No object dared enter and return. I set my gear down, surveying the space. Glow sticks, GPS markers, cameras, they had all failed. Observation alone had never worked, and tonight I understood why. The hole adapted. It observed us back, measuring and waiting. Madison held George close, standing at the far end of the attic. Her hands shook, lips pressed together. She looked toward the hole, and I could see her resolve crumbling. I think it wants him," she whispered. Her voice was calm now, almost too calm. The strain in her tone suggested something had already begun to influence her thoughts. "No." I stepped toward her. "You don't give it anything, not him." "Not you." Her eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment there was confusion, a crack in the calm. Then she turned toward the hole slowly, deliberately, as if drawn. George stirred in her arms, cooing softly, oblivious to the tension in the room. I moved faster than I had anticipated, grabbing her shoulders. "Madison, listen to me." Her gaze snapped to mine, pupils dilated, and she whispered, "It's okay. I understand now. It doesn't need to scream. Just a small gift." "Gift?" My voice trembled. "It's not a gift, Madison. You're thinking clearly." "Think clearly." But her body moved with purpose, leaning toward the hole. In a split second, I saw the black skeletal fingers curling at the edge, waiting to grasp, to pull. My instincts took over. I lunged, tackling her to the ground and wresting George from her grasp. She struggled, clawing, kicking, and screaming, but she wasn't truly resisting. Her motions were deliberate, almost ritualistic. I pinned her down, heart hammering, breath ragged. The Bowie knife by my side glinting faintly in the attic light. The hole pulsed, subtle but undeniable, as though aware of every heartbeat, every tremor of fear. Madison's left hand brushed its edge, and a skeletal appendage emerged to curl around hers in a mockery of comfort. I dragged her back, pushing her away. The moment was brief but definitive. She fell backward, crying silently, her gaze lingering on the hole as it absorbed her despair. George was safe in my arms. Madison retreated to the ladder, sobbing, muttering apologies. The hole remained, black and patient, as if it had claimed what it needed from her resignation alone. We didn't linger. I carried George to her sister's nearby house, ensuring he was safe. Madison remained in the attic, silent now, as though she had surrendered a part of herself to the hole's patient grasp. Later, the hole was removed. Transported carefully by the organization, it now resides in a secure containment vault. Attempts to interact with it outside its location consistently fail. It behaves according to no known physics or logic. I left the Mackenzie residence empty-handed in some ways, carrying only the memory of Madison's eyes, the feel of the air around the hole, the whispering that had embedded itself into my mind. The case was closed officially, but the psychological aftershocks lingered. The Mackenzie residence was quiet now, truly quiet. The oppressive heat of the attic, the subtle pull of the hole, and Madison's haunted expression were all memories that clung to me like shadows. I drove away slowly, George safe in his car seat at his sister's house, Madison still upstairs, withdrawn and silent. Back at the motel, the room felt impossibly large and hollow. Every corner was familiar yet alien. The hum of the air conditioner, which once had been comforting, now grated at my nerves. I unpacked my gear methodically, though each item felt heavier than it should. The Bowie knife, the runestones, the cameras, all useless against what we'd faced, I sank into the chair, exhausted, yet unable to stop thinking. The hole, Madison's eyes, the skeletal hand curling around hers, and the whispers. They had not left my mind. Not entirely. Even now I could hear faint echoes of the words, soft, almost imperceptible. They weren't coherent, but they lingered like static in the back of my brain. I forced myself to write notes, professional notes, observations, measurements, sketches. I called them documentation, but they were really an attempt to anchor myself, to convince my own mind that logic still mattered. Yet every line I wrote seemed insufficient. Words failed to capture the weight, the awareness, the presence. My rational mind protested, but the memory of the attic pressed down like a physical force gnawing at certainty. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the monotone hum of the air conditioner. Shadows in the room shifted subtly, imperceptibly in ways my mind catalogued obsessively. Every small flicker of movement set my pulse racing. I remembered Madison's calm when she approached the hole, her acceptance, the way her body had moved as if drawn. My hands clenched. So I hadn't been able to stop her entirely. I'd saved George, but Madison, had she lost something in that moment? A part of herself. The next morning I left for work with a hollow sense of routine. The office, normally filled with chatter and noise, felt muted. Faces seemed slightly off. Reflections lingered just a fraction too long. Every movement around me carried a subtle sense of observation, of measurement. The whole wasn't physically present, yet it had extended its reach into thought, perception, memory. Richard noticed first. "You look like hell," he said, eyes narrowing. "I'm fine," I muttered. My hands shook slightly as I poured coffee. He didn't press further, though I could tell he suspected. Everyone at the organization understood the danger of the anomalies we handled. But the whole was different. The others had seen it, but none had felt it reach inside their mind the way it had reached mine. I avoided revisiting the Mackenzie residence. Madison had been instructed to remain at her sister's for the time being. George was safe, but the memory of what had happened, the skeletal hand, Madison's surrender, haunted me. Every quiet moment, every empty room carried it. Sleep came fitfully, nightmares replacing rest. I was back in the attic repeatedly, standing at the edge of the hole. Shadows moved unnaturally, stretching, rippling. The air itself was aware, warm, insistent. I awoke each time with a pulse racing, hands cold, sweat-soaked sheets. Yet life had to continue. Work, routines, coffee, emails, all the banalities of normalcy. I forced myself to engage, though everything felt slightly distorted. The hole's echo persisted in subtle ways, a shadow lingering too long, a reflection that hesitated. Their voice, faint and almost indistinguishable, whispering from nowhere. Richard eventually asked about the case. "Mackenzie house, hole, how's she doing?" I exhaled slowly, measuredly. "George is fine. Madison is recovering, slowly." He nodded, accepting the vagueness. Some things couldn't be explained, not fully, not in words. At night I would sometimes visit the containment vault. The hole, caged and inert, was unassuming, deceptively mundane. Yet standing in front of it, I felt the same weight, the same pull. Observation was possible, but comprehension was not. The whispers were gone, the skeletal fingers retracted. Yet the knowledge that it existed, aware and patient, remained. I realized then that some things couldn't be contained completely, not physically, not mentally. The hole had left a mark, subtle and persistent, inside me. Even months later, I would catch myself staring at corners of rooms or pausing too long in the shadows, waiting, not for the hole itself, but for the feeling it left behind. The awareness, the patience, the quiet, deliberate pull on perception. Life continued. George grew. Madison slowly returned to herself, and I returned to work. But I had changed. The hole remained a silent witness in my mind, reminding me that observation alone is never enough. Some presences don't announce themselves. They insinuate, persist, and endure. The weeks after the Mackenzie incident passed in a blur of routine, though nothing felt entirely normal. Every morning, I would wake with a faint tightness in my chest, a reminder of the hole's presence in my mind. Coffee, work, commuting, they all became exercises in maintaining control over something that had already slipped. Even simple interactions were tinged with unease. At the office, colleagues seemed slightly off, their movements too precise, their speech too measured. Shadows in corners stretched subtly longer than they should. Reflections in glass lingered for an extra beat. Each small anomaly tugged at the edges of my perception, testing my composure. Madison and George had settled into relative normalcy. George laughed, played, and explored, without the weight of the attic pressing down on him. Madison was quieter, more measured in her movements, but I could still see the shadows beneath her eyes. Some part of her, I suspected, had remained in the attic. At night, my dreams returned. Not vivid nightmares, but subtle, insistent echoes of the attic. The oppressive heat, the pull of the hole, the whispers just beneath consciousness. I would wake, hands trembling slightly, trying to convince myself it was only a dream. But the weight in my chest persisted, a faint, constant pressure that I could neither see nor touch. One evening, I decided to revisit the containment vault. Standing in front of the hole, now secure and inert, I felt the same sense of patient awareness. The skeletal fingers were gone, the air was ordinary, yet the presence, the knowledge that it existed and watched, remained. Observation was possible, but understanding was beyond reach. The next day, subtle anomalies began appearing in my environment. A misplaced pen, a chair shifted slightly, shadows stretching at odd angles. Each small deviation gnawed at my mind, forcing me to catalogue, measure, and question. My notes became obsessive, documenting minutiae that once would have seemed irrelevant. Even outside the house, perception felt subtly altered. Street lights cast uneven glows, reflections lingered too long, and occasional whispers, too soft to identify, seemed to ride the wind. Rational thought told me these were coincidences, artifacts of fatigue, stress, or imagination. But deep down I knew they were echoes of the whole, lingering in subtle, insidious ways. I realized then that some presences cannot be contained entirely. Even when physically removed, their influence can linger, quietly altering perception and memory. Observation alone, while useful, was insufficient. The whole had reached into thought, perception, and reality itself in ways that left permanent traces. Despite this, life continued. Work, routine, minor social interactions, they all continued under a veneer of normalcy. Yet I remained vigilant, aware that some subtle, patient anomaly could always be watching, waiting, influencing in ways imperceptible yet undeniable. Even months later, I would sometimes pause in hallways, catch a fleeting shadow in a reflection, or feel the faint pull of an unseen presence. And in those moments I remembered the attic, Madison, George, and the whole. Patient, deliberate, and aware, sleep had become unreliable, almost a foreign concept. Every time I closed my eyes, the attic returned, not vividly, but insidiously. Shadows that stretched and rippled, air that pressed against my skin, whispers that rose faintly in the corners of my mind. It wasn't a dream exactly, nor a memory. It was a fusion of both, a shadowy presence threading itself into thought. During the day, subtle distortions persisted. I would glance at a doorway and feel the space bend, a wall appearing slightly closer than it should. Reflections in glass, mirrors, windows, even my own phone screen lingered an extra beat. Sometimes I could swear I caught a movement at the very edge, a shadow that shouldn't exist. Rational thought insisted it was fatigue, but the pull at the edges of perception suggested otherwise. I became meticulous, obsessive even, in cataloguing everything. Notes, sketches, measurements. I documented small anomalies in my own apartment, the slight tilt of a picture frame, the way shadows pooled under the bed at odd angles, the occasional whisper of air that seemed directed rather than random. Each anomaly added weight to the knowledge that the whole's influence had not ended. It had only receded into subtlety, persistent and patient. Madison and George visited occasionally. George remained cheerful, innocent, untouched by the attic's influence. Madison, however, carried traces of it. She flinched at shadows, hesitated in certain rooms, and her hands trembled in ways that suggested unseen pressure. I tried to assure her gently that it was only residual fear, only stress. Yet deep down I knew the whole had left a mark, a psychological residue that could not be erased. One night the pull returned stronger. I lay in bed, the weight in my chest pressing down, and felt the subtle tug of the whole's awareness in the back of my mind. Shadows in the room stretched and curled, responding to my thoughts. I rose, hands trembling, and checked every door, every window. Nothing was physically wrong, yet the feeling persisted. A presence just beyond the edges of comprehension, observing, measuring. Dreams became sharper, more insistent. I stood once again at the edge of the attic hole, staring into its impossible depth. Shadows writhed in response to my gaze,